So thank you for inviting me here from Sweden to Cyprus. For us Swedes, Cyprus is a place where we go to have a vacation, so we really like your country. Well, most of what I was aiming to talk about today has been said. See this as much as a conclusion and see it as a call to action. Like the speaker before me said, I urge a call for action. I've been working in this area I've been working in the gambling industry for 30 years. I've been working in sustainable business for 20 years. There is still a lot of talk the talk. Let's walk the talk, as you do here in Cyprus. Well, which button I use? Mac? Is it that one? Okay. There has been a great development for the last 5 years, actually, connected to the corporate social responsibility. Responsible gaming is the focus area for the gambling industry in the CSR business. But you need to be aware there are certain other things that can turn up. For instance, Greta from my country could turn up and actually end up a business around. There also are, of course, different kinds of things that you as a gambling business could do, like integration, environment, equal terms, match fixing. That's a very important issue as well. Yeah.
Any other country, the jurisdiction is in Cyprus in the online realm, and we do have cases. We do have cases that we have received mainly from the UK because of the language, where the jurisdiction is Cyprus and where we resolve them based on our code. So it works. In terms of what you said before, how do you keep the industry united? I think it's a fairly simple question. You either self-regulate or agree to be part of this discussion, or basically the discussion will be without you.
Right.
It's as simple as that.
Right. I just noticed we have some questions. There was one question, how could you prevent minors from viewing advertising? Would you like to answer that?
Well, actually, it made me think of the conversation we had just out there at the coffee before the things started this morning. How can you avoid minors from viewing advertising on the internet and social media? Well, I suppose to a degree you can and you can't. It's a bit like Watershed on TV. If it's 9 p.m, you assume that after 9 p.m, the TV content is less suitable for minors. Well, maybe not those at 17, but at least those at 5 years of age. And that they won't be viewing the television at that time when gambling adverts come on. That also requires some parental control. At the same time, how do you monitor minors' behaviour on the internet? I think in that sense there would have to be rules about where advertising could be placed, and that it wouldn't be able to be placed on websites that could or are primarily directed towards children. But at a certain point I think it's also extremely difficult to, if there's no verification, age verification, prior to somebody viewing a page, it's extremely difficult to then exclude minors from seeing any advertising on that page.
There's also another way to try to do it is obviously, especially on social media, we know that children declare an age that is not compatible to their actual age, but if you also contextualize the ad, for example, say I am interested in somebody who has interest in gambling, but also is looking for a new car. So if you combine those, you might eliminate people that are looking for, people that are just minors.
It's another interesting question. We discussed Italy, and the question is, isn't it too soon to judge the outcome of the Italian ban on advertising? Is there any independent research on the findings, the results of this? Somebody likes to...
I mentioned the example of Italy and the study that was conducted. Indeed, it might be too soon to judge the actual impact. I don't think there are figures on the actual impact, but there are already studies conducted, and the most recent one was conducted by the Italian Health Institute. It's public, and it clearly stated that advertising should not be linked with addiction. that there is no evidence proving that advertising leads necessarily to increased gambling behavior or problem gambling. So it's the start of a judgment, I would say. Yes, we can expect more in the days to come.
There will be more evaluation in the future. Unfortunately, our time is over, so there are some questions left. If you'd like to address these questions to the panelists, we're happy to talk to you. But since I'm German, this panel is like a Lufthansa flight. We land on time. Would you like to welcome me and thanking my panelists for the excellent contribution? Thank you very much, and thanks for your...
Ευχαριστούμε λοιπόν όλους τους ομιλητές. Απομόνωσα κάποια στοιχεία. Από φέτος λοιπόν εξετάζουμε τα μέτρα που λαμβάνουν οι χώρες μέλη της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης για τη διαφήμιση, κυρία Φιάκου. Από φέτος το εξετάζουμε. Μία από τις δυσκολίες είναι να φιλτράρουμε το υλικό στα μέσα κοινωνικής δικτύωσης. Οι πλατφόρμες επομένως πρέπει να είναι αυστηρές και συζητείται κώδικας περιεχομένου διαφήμισης για τα τυχερά παιχνίδια και αυτό είναι το ευχάριστο. Τώρα, καλώ στο βήμα τον Dr. Ποτέντζα για τη δική του παρουσίαση. Παρακαλώ.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this beautiful country with its long and rich history, and also for hosting this very important event and inviting me to talk on responsible gambling and the public health. So as I do with all of my talks these days, I have a listing of relationships with the pharmaceutical, gambling, and legal entities. I thought I'd start by talking about what is gambling. And so one definition of gambling is that it's placing something of value at risk in the hopes of gaining something of greater value. So in some ways, this should be a relatively straightforward description, but what constitutes gambling and what doesn't constitute gambling remains debated, as for example in the case of loot boxes or in the case of daily fantasy sports. So I've argued in the past that this perception of gambling may be influenced by the relative amount of risk and reward associated with the behavior, as one can see in stock market behaviors. But with respect to traditional forms of gambling, most adults around the globe, in most jurisdictions at least, gamble and do so without developing problems. But I would also argue that at a public health level, it's important to consider the entire range of gambling behaviors. And so we've argued that gambling can be seen along a spectrum from non-gambling to disordered gambling. And that there are many factors at the individual and social and societal level that may influence the level of gambling behavior as well as transitions between these levels. So when is gambling a problem? This has also been debated. If the gambling behaviors lie along a spectrum, how do we separate problematic from non-problematic gambling? However, several of the psychiatric nomenclature systems, for example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the International Classification of Diseases, have defined criteria for conditions relating to problematic gambling. And so these are the current editions or the forthcoming edition of the DSM and the ICD. And in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the term pathological gambling was introduced in 1980. There were changes made in the 80s and 90s with respect to the inclusionary criteria. It was defined as an impulse control disorder. And they're going from DSM-4 to DSM-5 in 2013. There were additional changes in the criteria for the disorder, the thresholding, how many criteria are needed to meet a disorder, and then how the disorder was classified. And this information about the reclassification was based on data that had accumulated over the course of decades. And why does classification matter? I think that it's very important. For example, in France, the government requires addiction treatment centers to provide care for people with behavioral addictions. So if gambling disorder is classified as a behavioral addiction, as it is now in DSM-5, this has direct clinical implications. So ICD-11 was being generated over the past several years, and there were questions that existed with respect to whether the ICD-11 would harmonize with the DSM-5. And so I was involved in multiple World Health Organization work groups that considered internet use behaviors and behavioral addictions, including gambling. And as we've heard about earlier today, the technology, digital technologies in the internet have changed many behaviors, including gambling. The World Health Assembly adopted the ICD-11 earlier this year in May 2019, and they followed the DSM-5 in some ways, but differed from the DSM-5 in other ways. So gambling disorder was the diagnostic entity that was adopted, changing from pathological gambling, like in the DSM. And this was done because it was felt that the term pathological was a barrier for people seeking help. And it's estimated that about 10% of people with a gambling disorder ever seek treatment for their gambling problems. Importantly, gambling disorder was classified as a disorder due to addictive behaviors. And so this follows the reclassification of gambling disorder in the DSM-5 as a behavioral addiction. One thing that was different in the ICD-11 as compared to the DSM-5 was that there were specifiers for the behavior being done predominantly offline or predominantly online. And I think this speaks to the changes that are occurring with respect to gambling behaviors and other behaviors on the internet. So what are some of the changes? Over the past decade or so, there's been a tripling of the internet gambling market. And there are data to suggest that the risk factors for individuals developing problems with internet gambling may be different from those risk factors that are associated with offline gambling. So for example, in Connecticut high school students, we found that there's less of a link with peer or other friends, family members gambling, linking at-risk problem gambling behaviors amongst the internet gambling group. I would also argue that particular forms of gambling may be particularly risky on the internet. So live action or during the sporting event types of gambling appear to be highly risky for individuals. And so this raises questions about the role of the media. So for example, in the setting of deregulation, if you will, in the United States on sports gambling, with the Supreme Court overturning the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, more states are legalizing sports gambling. The media, for example, ESPN, is showing programs that focus on wagering, and that some of the gray areas, if you will, of sports gambling, daily fantasy sports, are now becoming engaged in sports gambling. So I would also argue that gambling and gaming are converging behaviors. And this can be seen with respect to not only daily fantasy sports, but loot boxes and loot crates in different jurisdictions, thinking about whether these are gambling or not. Social casino games, which may not involve placing monetary bets, but do teach individuals, and particularly I think we should be mindful of teaching children about the rules of, if you will, of casino gambling, may be particularly concerning. particularly if there are microtransactions where people need to pay money over time to continue or go to higher levels, as these have been linked to youth developing gambling problems. And this continues with respect to integrating casino gambling into video games, like in Grand Theft Auto. There was a recent introduction of casino gambling there, and this has been debated across the Twitter sphere with respect to how this should be regulated.